She walked into his barn with a baby and no shoes. He said, "The stove is lit." The barn door opened at midnight, and Harlan Jessup looked up from the mare he was tending to see a woman standing in the gap. She was barefoot. That was the first thing he noticed. Her feet were black with mud and streaked with blood, where the rocks and frozen ground had torn the skin. She wore a thin cotton dress that hung on her frame like a feed sack on a fence post, and she held a bundle against her chest, a baby, wrapped in a shawl so threadbare he could see the child's skin through the weave. She did not speak. She stood in the doorway with the November wind cutting past her and looked at him with eyes that held nothing, not fear, not hope, not pleading, just the flat, exhausted blankness of a person who had walked past the end of their endurance and kept going because stopping was not a thing their body knew how to do. Harlan set down the curry comb. He stood slowly, the way he would approach a spooked animal, and took 3 steps toward her. "The stove is lit," he said. "In the house. Come on." She followed him across the yard without a word. He held the kitchen door open and she walked through it. And when the warmth from the cook stove hit her, she swayed on her feet and caught herself on the edge of the table. The baby made a small sound, not crying, just a thin mewling that was almost worse than crying, and she tightened her grip on the bundle and stood there, dripping mud onto his kitchen floor, waiting. Harlan pulled a chair from the table and set it beside the stove. "Sit," he said. She sat. He poured water from the kettle into a basin, found a clean cloth, and set both on the floor beside her feet. Then he went to the larder and came back with bread, cold bacon, and a jar of milk. He set the food on the table within her reach and stepped back. She looked at the food. She looked at him. Then she began to eat, not fast, not desperately, but with the mechanical steadiness of someone who had been hungry long enough that eating had become a task rather than a pleasure. She tore the bread into small pieces and ate each one completely before reaching for the next. She ate half the bacon and drank the milk in careful sips. The baby nursed from a corner of bread soaked in milk, sucking weakly but steadily. Harlan sat across the room on the wood box and watched without speaking. He was 43 years old, a cattle rancher who had worked this land alone since his wife Clara died of scarlet fever 7 years ago. He was not a man given to sentiment or spontaneous kindness. He was practical, methodical, and generally suspicious of people who showed up uninvited. But there were things you did not turn away from, and a barefoot woman with a baby in November was one of them. When she had eaten, she cleaned her feet in the basin. The cuts were shallow but numerous, and he saw that the soles were not just torn, but worn. The thick, calloused skin of someone who had been without shoes for weeks, not hours. She washed each foot carefully, dabbed the cuts dry, and wrapped them in the cloth without asking for bandages. "There's a bed in the back room," he said. "It's made up. I'll sleep out here." She looked at him for a long time. Then she spoke for the first time, and her voice was so hoarse he could barely hear it. "Why?" "Because it's November," he said, "and you don't have shoes." Her name was Delia Marsh. He learned this the next morning, when she came out of the back room with the baby on her hip, and sat at the table, and told him in short, flat sentences what had brought her to his barn. Her husband had died of a fever 6 months ago in a mining camp near Cripple Creek. She had tried to work, laundry, cooking, anything, but the camp was shutting down and there was no work to be had. She had sold everything she owned, except the baby's shawl and her dress, and when the money ran out, she started walking south, because someone at the camp had told her there was work in Pueblo. She had been walking for 9 days. She had lost her shoes crossing a creek on the 4th day, and she had not been able to replace them. The baby's name was Emmeline. She was 5 months old. She told it all, without self-pity, without embellishment, in the flat tone of a woman reciting facts rather than asking for sympathy. Her husband, James, had been a decent man but a poor planner, the kind of person who believed that the next strike would change everything, who chased silver the way some men chased whiskey, with an optimism that was indistinguishable from recklessness. When he died, he left her nothing but the baby and a canvas tent with a hole in the roof. The camp had not been kind. The other miners' wives regarded her as competition for the dwindling scrub work. The camp boss had suggested, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding, an arrangement that she had refused. After that, the laundry jobs dried up, the cooking jobs disappeared, and she found herself standing at the edge of a played-out mining camp with a baby in her arms and nowhere to go but the road. Harlan listened to all of this without interruption. When she finished, he poured her coffee and set a plate of eggs in front of her. "Pueblo is 60 miles from here," he said. "You wouldn't have made it." "I know. What kind of work were you looking for?" "Anything. Cooking, cleaning, mending. I can do laundry. I can tend animals." She paused. "I'm not asking for charity. I'll work for whatever you can spare." Harlan looked at her, at the hollowed cheeks, the cracked hands, the baby on her hip who was watching him with wide, solemn eyes, and made a decision that he would not fully understand for months. "I need help around this place," he said. "The house hasn't been properly kept since my wife died. There's mending piling up. The kitchen garden's gone to seed, and I've been eating my own cooking for 7 years, which is punishment enough for any man." He took a sip of his coffee. "Room and board, and whatever egg money the chickens bring in, you'd have the back room." She studied his face, the way a person studies a contract, looking for the hidden clause. He met her gaze steadily and waited. "All right," she said. The arrangement began carefully. Delia worked with a quiet, relentless efficiency that startled him. Within a week, the house was cleaner than it had been since Clara's time. She scrubbed the floors, washed the windows, beat the dust from the curtains, and reorganized the pantry with a precision that suggested a military background, though it turned out to be the habit of a woman who had spent her childhood in a succession of foster homes where order was the only thing you could control. She mended his shirts with stitches so small and even, he had to hold the fabric up to the light to find them. She patched the holes in the curtains, reattached the broken handle on the water pump, and discovered a nest of mice in the pantry wall that she eliminated with a combination of steel wool and peppermint oil that he had never heard of, but that worked better than any trap he had ever set. The baby, too, seemed to settle. Emmeline gained weight, her cheeks filling out, her cries growing stronger and more purposeful. She slept through the night for the first time in Delia's memory, and in the mornings she woke with a gurgling, contented sound that filled the back room and drifted through the house like something warm being poured. She cooked meals that made him sit at the table longer than he had in years. Not elaborate food. She worked with what was available, but everything she made had a warmth to it that he could not explain, a quality that went beyond seasoning. She made biscuits that were somehow both crisp and tender, and stews that tasted like they had been simmering for hours even when she had thrown them together in 30 minutes, and coffee that was better than any he had ever made, though she used the same beans and the same pot. He found himself looking forward to meals in a way he had not done since Clara died, and the recognition of that unsettled him. He had built his grief into the architecture of his daily life, the empty chair, the untouched side of the bed, the silence at supper, and Delia's presence was quietly dismantling it, one meal at a time. Emmeline grew. That was the thing that caught him off guard. Not the woman, but the baby. She went from the thin, silent bundle Delia had carried through his barn door to a round-cheeked, bright-eyed creature who crawled across his kitchen floor and grabbed at his bootlaces and made sounds that were not quite words, but carried the unmistakable inflection of opinions. She laughed when the barn cat walked past. She cried when she was hungry. She reached for him one morning from Delia's arms, and when he took her, carefully, awkwardly, the way a man handles something he is afraid of breaking, she put her hand on his face and held it there, and he felt something shift in his chest that he could not name and did not want to examine. He made her a cradle. He told himself it was practical. The child needed somewhere to sleep that was not Delia's arms or a pile of blankets on the floor. He used cedar from a tree he had felled the previous spring, and he sanded the boards until they were smooth enough to press against bare skin without catching. He carved 2 small stars on the headboard, because Clara had liked stars, and because the baby, he had noticed, stared at the night sky through the window with an attention that seemed, for an infant, remarkably focused. He set the cradle in the back room without ceremony. Delia looked at it for a long time, running her fingers over the sanded wood and the carved stars. And when she looked up at him, her eyes were bright. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "The child needs a bed." "That's not a bed. That's a piece of furniture someone made with care." He did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing and went out to the barn. Winter settled in hard. The temperature dropped, snow covered the range, and the cattle required daily tending, breaking ice on the water troughs, hauling hay to the feeding grounds, checking for sick animals in the early morning dark. Harlan worked from before dawn to after dusk, and when he came in each evening, stamping snow from his boots and hanging his coat by the door, the kitchen was warm and lit, and the smell of whatever Delia was cooking reached him before he crossed the threshold. He began to notice things, the way she hummed while she worked, low, tuneless melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her body, the way she held Emmeline on her hip while she stirred a pot with her free hand, moving through the kitchen with a grace that was born of necessity rather than refinement, the way she looked at him sometimes when she thought he was not watching, a quick, assessing glance that held something he could not quite read, something that might have been gratitude or might have been something else entirely. One night in December, Emmeline woke crying at 2 a.m, and Harlan heard Delia pacing the back room, the floorboards creaking softly under her bare feet. He pulled on his boots and knocked on the door. "She's teething," Delia said, looking exhausted. "She won't settle. Give her here." He took the baby and walked her through the kitchen, holding her against his shoulder with one large hand on her back. He walked in slow circles around the table, the way he had once walked colicky calves, steady, rhythmic, patient, and he talked to her in the same low voice he used with the horses, saying nothing in particular, just providing the sound of a human being who was not going anywhere. Within 10 minutes, Emmeline was asleep. He carried her back to the cradle and set her down carefully. Delia was standing in the doorway, watching him with an expression he had never seen on her face, or on anyone's face. And when he straightened up, she reached out and touched his arm. Just a touch, just her fingers on his sleeve. Then she pulled her hand back and said goodnight, and he went back to his bed on the kitchen floor and lay awake for a long time, feeling the place on his arm where her fingers had been. On Christmas Eve, she made a pie from dried apples and the last of the brown sugar, and they ate it together at the table, while Emmeline slept in the cedar cradle, and the snow fell silently outside the window. It was the first Christmas Harlan had observed in 7 years. "Clara would have liked you," he said, and the words surprised him as much as they surprised her. Delia set down her fork. "You don't talk about her much." "No. You should. She matters." He looked at her across the table, at the candlelight on her face, at the flour dusted across her forearm, at the steady, quiet certainty in her eyes, and he realized that what he felt for this woman was not gratitude, and not pity, and not the simple comfort of shared space. It was something older and more dangerous, something he had thought he had buried with Clara in the plot behind the barn. He did not say it. He was not ready, but he stopped pretending he did not feel it. Spring came slowly, the way it does in the high country, grudgingly, in fits and starts, the snow retreating and returning again, until the ground finally appeared, brown and wet and ready. Delia planted the kitchen garden, beans, squash, onions, potatoes, and Harlan watched her work the soil with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, her hands sure and steady. Emmeline sitting in a basket at the end of the row, chewing on a wooden spoon. One evening in April, he came in from the barn and found a pair of boots on the back porch. Women's boots, new, the leather stiff and unbroken. He had ordered them from the mercantile in town 3 weeks ago, using the measurements he had taken from one of Delia's footprints in the garden mud. Delia was standing in the kitchen with the boot's twin in her hand. He had left the other one inside the door. She was looking at him the way she had looked at the cradle, with an expression that was too large for words. "You've been barefoot long enough," he said. She set down the boot. She crossed the kitchen floor, barefoot still, for the last time, and she put her hands on either side of his face, and she kissed him. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was soft and deliberate and tasted like coffee and flour. And when she pulled back, her eyes were wet. "I walked into your barn with nothing," she said, "and you gave me everything." "You walked into my barn with a baby," he said. "That's not nothing." Emmeline chose that moment to pull herself up on the leg of a kitchen chair and stand, wobbling for the first time. She looked at them both with an expression of pleased surprise, swayed once, and sat down hard on the floor. They both laughed, and the kitchen was warm, and the stove was lit, and outside the window the garden was green and the snow was gone from the mountains, and the world was exactly the size of a farmhouse kitchen where 3 people were learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to be a family.